Confucius never wrote a single word of the book with his name on it. Not one line. The most quoted teacher in Chinese history, the man whose sayings have travelled for 2,500 years, the name that ends up printed on posters and calendars and, yes, on little slips of paper tucked inside cookies, he did not sit down and write any of it. He left no book behind. He wrote nothing that survives. And the strange, quiet thing we are going to spend this long night with is that this is the most interesting fact about him. The book we call his is not really his at all. It is a book made of memory. It is what other people remembered him saying, long after he could no longer say anything. Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Settle in. There is nowhere you need to be for the next few hours, except exactly where you are right now, lying down, letting the day loosen its grip finger by finger. You do not need to know anything about Confucius to be here tonight. You do not need to have read a page of him. You do not need to remember any of the names or the dates or the foreign words I am going to say slowly and gently as we go. If you already know a little, you can set that knowing down too. There is no test at the end of this. There is no end of this, really, only the soft place where you drift off, and I keep talking a while longer for whatever part of you is still listening. That is the whole arrangement. You listen as long as you like, and then you sleep. If you feel like it, before your eyes get too heavy, you might leave a small note in the comments, just the time where you are and the place you are listening from. A city, a country, a dark bedroom somewhere on the turning earth. It is a quiet pleasure, reading in the morning where everyone was when they let go of the day. But that is entirely optional, and if your hands are already tired, and your phone is already face down, good, that is even better. Let it stay face down. Take a slow, deep breath now. In through the nose, gently, no effort, and let it out long and unhurried, the way a room exhales when someone finally sits down in it. Feel the weight of your own body against whatever is holding it. The mattress, the pillow, the blanket settling over you like snow settling on a field, without hurry, without sound. You do not have to do anything with your thoughts tonight. Let them wander in and wander out. They are welcome, and they are not important. Thank you for being here. Let us begin. So, he wrote none of it. Sit with that for a moment, because it is stranger than it first sounds. Most of the famous old books of the world were written, at least in part, by the person we credit them to, or by someone in the room who was trying to get it down as it happened. But the book we call the Analects is not like that. It came together the way a memory of a grandparent comes together, years after the funeral, in fragments, at the kitchen table. When the relatives are gathered, and someone says, "Do you remember how he used to say?" and someone else says, "No, that's not quite how he put it, he said it more like this." And a third person leans in and adds a detail the first two had forgotten. That is not so far from how this book was made. It is a book of people saying, "Do you remember how the master said?" The book has a name, an old and honest name, and it is worth learning it slowly because the name itself tells you almost everything. In Chinese it is called the Lunyu. 2 syllables. Lun, you. You do not need to hold on to it, but let it rest in the air a moment. Lunyu, the word is usually rendered into English as something like selected sayings, or, my favourite, edited conversations. Edited conversations. Think about what a modest, truthful title that is for a book that founded a tradition. It does not call itself the teachings. It does not call itself the law, or the way, or the truth. It calls itself, more or less, the conversations we picked out and put in order. It admits, right there in its own name, that it is second-hand. It admits that someone had to select, and someone had to edit, and that these are the parts that got kept. A book that tells you, in its title, that it is made of leftovers. The good leftovers. The ones worth saving. But leftovers all the same, gathered up after the meal was over and the guest of honor had gone home. And who did the gathering? His students. The people who had actually sat with him, who had heard him say these things in the ordinary course of a day, over a meal, on a walk, in answer to a foolish question, in a moment of grief. They remembered. And then, when they too grew old, their students remembered what they had remembered. And so it passed down, hand to hand, mouth to ear, the way a family story passes down, getting shaped a little by each person who carries it, before anyone ever fixed it in writing. We will come back to those people, the rememberers, later in the night, because they are some of the most touching figures in the whole thing. For now, just hold the shape of it, a teacher who wrote nothing, and a book that is nothing but what the people who loved him managed to keep. Here is what that origin does to the book. It makes it strange to read. If you have ever picked up the Analects expecting something like a philosophy book, expecting arguments that build, chapter 1 leading into chapter 2, a system laid out brick by brick until the whole cathedral stands, you will be baffled by it. Because it is not that. It does not build. It does not argue in long lines. It jumps. It stops. It starts again somewhere else with no explanation. One moment you are hearing about how to treat your parents, and the next, with no bridge at all, you are hearing a single remark about music. And then a fragment about a man you have never heard of, who is not introduced and never appears again. It reads, honestly, like a notebook, like someone's private notebook of overheard remarks. And that is exactly what it is. Let me show you the texture of it, because the texture is the whole point, and it is the kind of thing that is much easier to feel than to be told. Open the book almost anywhere, and you will find over and over the same 3 words at the start of an entry, the master said. In the original language it is even shorter, just 2 syllables, ziye, zi, meaning the master, ye, meaning said, ziye, the master said. And then comes one remark, 1 sentence, maybe 2. And then it stops. There is no scene set for you. Nobody tells you what day it was, or where they were sitting, or what had just happened to make him say it, or who he was talking to, or whether anyone answered. The master said, and then the thing he said, and then silence. And then the next one begins. The master said again about something else entirely. Imagine finding in a drawer a stack of index cards, and on each card someone has written one thing your grandfather once said, and nothing else. No context. Just the saying, floating, cut loose from the afternoon it belonged to. That is what a great deal of the Analects feels like. And I want you to notice that this is not a flaw, this is the fingerprint of how the book was made. Because there was no author sitting there to smooth it all out, to write the connecting sentences, to explain, to arrange it into a flowing lecture. Because it was assembled out of what people happened to remember, you get the raw remark and nothing around it. You get the saying without the scaffolding. You are not hearing the lecture, you are hearing the notebook. You are overhearing, across all those centuries, the actual thing the man said, stripped of everything except itself. And there is a soft kind of intimacy in that, once you stop expecting it to behave like a textbook. A polished book keeps you at a distance. It has been arranged for you, presented to you, dressed up. But a notebook of overheard remarks lets you lean close. You feel less like a student in a lecture hall and more like a person sitting quietly in the corner of a room where a wise old man is talking, and you are catching what you can. Some of it you understand. Some of it drifts past you. Some of it you will only understand years later, on a night you cannot sleep. That is the right way to hold this book. Loosely overhearing. Now, the way the book is organized, if you can even call it organized, tells the same story, and it is one of my favorite small details in the whole thing, the kind of detail that makes you smile in the dark. The Analects is divided into 20 parts. In Chinese, these parts are called pian, which you can think of simply as chapters, or books, or bundles, 20 bundles of these little sayings. And here is the lovely part. Each of those 20 bundles has a name. But the names are not what you would expect. They are not on virtue and on ritual and on government, the way a modern editor would title the chapters, sorting everything neatly by subject. No, each of the 20 parts is simply named after the first 2 or 3 words of its very first line. Let that land for a second, because it is quietly wonderful. The first bundle opens with a line about learning, and the first 2 words happen to be, roughly, to learn, sue. And so that is the name of the whole first book. Sue. To learn, and. Not because the whole book is about learning, just because that is how it happens to begin. It is exactly the way you would label folders if you had a mess of loose papers and no time to actually read and sort them all. You would grab the top sheet of each pile, glance at the first few words, and write those words on the folder, just so you could tell the piles apart. That is not the filing system of an author with a grand design. That is the filing system of people faithfully organizing scraps that someone else left behind. It is the honest, slightly makeshift housekeeping of the people who inherited the memory and were doing their best to keep it in some kind of order. And I find that unbearably human, in the gentlest way. These were not people trying to build a monument. They were people with a shoebox full of their teachers' sayings, trying not to lose any of them, labeling the bundles by their first words so nothing would get muddled, so that in 100 years someone could still find the one they were looking for. The grandeur came later. The tradition, the temples, the influence over an entire civilization, all of that came centuries down the road. At the start it was just this. A stack of remembered sayings, bundled and labelled by their opening words, kept safe by people who did not want to forget. So the book is fragmentary. It is abrupt. It jumps and stops and refuses to explain itself. It is a notebook, not a treatise. And you might reasonably expect a book like that, a book with no author to make it welcoming, no introduction to ease you in, to open coldly. You might expect it to begin with a rule, a command, thou shalt, a stern instruction about duty, about obedience, about how a person must behave. That is the version of Confucius that has come down through the centuries in the popular imagination, isn't it? The stern old moralist wagging his finger. The man of rules and rank and do, as you are told. But that is not how the book begins. And this is the first of many gentle surprises I want to give you tonight. The first place where the real book turns out to be softer and stranger than its reputation. The Analects does not open with a command. It opens with pleasure. It opens with joy. It opens, of all things, with a kind of quiet happiness that anyone, in any century, lying in any bed, could recognize. Here is the very first line of the whole book, the top card of the whole stack, the sentence those students chose, out of everything they could have led with, to stand at the front door of the entire tradition. Listen. Is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to try it out at the proper time? Is it not a joy to have friends come from far away? And, the line goes on, is it not the mark of a fine person that he feels no bitterness when others fail to recognize him? Sit with how gentle that is. That is where it starts. Not with a law, with a pleasure. The pleasure of learning something and then, later, at the right moment, getting to actually use it. The small, warm satisfaction of a thing you studied finally coming in handy. The way a word you just learned suddenly appears in a book the next day, and you feel a little glow of recognition. That is where the most influential teacher in Chinese history chooses to begin. With that ordinary, homely pleasure. Not learning as a grim duty, learning as a quiet delight. And then the second joy, even warmer than the first. Is it not a joy to have friends come from far away? Picture it. In a time before roads were easy, before travel was safe or quick, when a journey of any distance was a real undertaking with real danger, a friend arriving from far away meant something. It meant someone had crossed all of that distance willingly to see you, to sit with you, to talk into the evening. There is nothing abstract in that line. There is no doctrine in it. It is the simple, universal happiness of a knock at the door and a familiar face on the other side of it. Someone who travelled a long way just to be in the same room as you again. 2,500 years later, in a completely different world, you know that feeling exactly. You have felt it. That is the second thing the book puts at its front door. And the third is almost consoling. It is not a joy at all, but something quieter and more grown up. It is the observation that a truly settled person does not grow bitter when he goes unrecognized, when his worth is not seen, when the world does not give him the credit he might feel he is owed. To feel no resentment about that, the line suggests, is the mark of a person who has something solid inside them. And is that not a thing worth hearing softly at the end of a day, when maybe part of what kept you awake was the small, gnawing sense of not being seen, not being thanked, not being recognized for what you carried today? The very first page of this ancient book reaches out across all those centuries and touches exactly that ache, and does not scold it, only quietly names the peace that lies on the far side of it. That is how it begins. Pleasure, joy, and the calm of not needing the world's applause. Not a rule in sight. And I think that opening tells you more about the man in the fragments than any list of his doctrines ever could. Because a man remembered this way, remembered as someone who began with the pleasure of learning and the joy of a friend's arrival, was a man his students found warm, was a man worth crossing a long distance to see, was a man whose company was itself one of those pleasures. They could have led with anything. They led with joy. That was the door they wanted to leave open at the front of the house. And notice, too, what the opening does not do, because the silences in this book are as telling as the words. It does not begin by establishing his authority. It does not begin, Confucius, the great sage, master of all wisdom, decreed. It does not puff him up. It does not announce him. It just starts, mid-thought almost, with a small human pleasure, as though you had walked into the middle of a conversation that was already comfortable, already underway, already among friends. Which, in a way, you have. You have walked into the middle of a very old, very warm conversation. And you are welcome to stay in the corner of the room and listen for as long as you like. Let us pause here for a moment. There is no hurry. We have a long, slow night ahead of us, and everything worth saying will still be here when we return to it. So let the last few thoughts settle, like sediment drifting down through still water to the bottom of a glass, leaving everything clear above. Take a slow, deep breath. In, gently, without forcing anything. And out, long and easy, letting your shoulders drop a little further from your ears than they were a moment ago. Notice the weight of your body. Notice how the bed holds you completely, asking nothing of you, requiring no effort at all on your part to be held. Your arms are heavy. Your legs are heavy. Even your face is beginning to soften, the small muscles around your eyes and your jaw letting go of the day's holding. You do not need to remember anything we have said. Not the name of the book, not the words in the old language. If it has already begun to blur, let it blur. The blurring is good. The blurring is the day letting go of you. If one small thing stayed with you, that he wrote none of it, maybe, or that it begins with a pleasure and not a rule, let that be enough. And if nothing stayed, that is enough too. There is nothing to carry into sleep. You can set all of it down, right here, and simply rest in the sound of a voice in a dark room, talking gently about very old and very human things. When you are ready, and only then, we will continue together, slowly, into the story of the people who did the remembering. For now, just breathe, and let it settle. We were saying that he wrote none of it, and that the book, by its own honest name, admits to being second-hand, edited conversations, the sayings that got selected and kept. And I want to stay a little longer inside that fact before we move on to the people, because there is something in it that gets more beautiful the longer you hold it, the way certain quiet ideas do at night, when the noise of the day is not there to hurry you past them. Think about what it means for a thing to survive as memory before it ever survives as writing. We are so used to the idea that important things get written down right away, that the moment something matters, someone records it. But for a long stretch at the very beginning, this teaching existed nowhere except inside the minds of the people who had heard it. It was not on any page. It was not carved anywhere. It lived only in the soft, unreliable, precious storage of human memory. The same place your childhood lives, the same place the sound of a particular person's voice lives after they are gone. That is where the whole thing was kept at first, in people. And it stayed alive because those people said it to each other, and then said it to younger people, who said it to younger people still. A chain of voices reaching forward through time, each one carrying the words a little further before, at last, generations on, someone began to set them down. That is a fragile way for anything to travel. Memory shifts. Memory softens some things and sharpens others. Two people who stood in the same room hear the same sentence differently and remember it differently, and pass on their two slightly different versions, both of them sincere, both of them faithful, neither of them exactly the same. And here is the thing that I find so moving about the Analects, and that we will come to properly a little later in the night. The book does not hide this. It does not smooth the differences away. When several people remembered the master answering the same kind of question in different ways, the book, more often than not, simply kept all the versions. It laid the different memories side by side and let them stand without deciding which one was the true one. Because in a way, they were all true. They were all what somebody genuinely remembered. The unevenness is not a defect in the record. The unevenness is the proof that it is a real record, kept by real people, each holding their own honest piece of a man too large for any one of them to hold entirely. You have your own version of this in your own life, if you think about it as you lie there. The people you have loved and lost, you do not carry a single official version of them, you carry a scatter of remembered moments. a thing they said once, in a particular tone, on a particular afternoon. The way they laughed. A piece of advice that you are no longer even sure they gave in those exact words, but that feels like them, sounds like them, could only have come from them. And if you and someone else who loved that same person compared your memories, you would not perfectly agree. You would each have your own fragments. And out of all your fragments together, laid side by side, something like the whole person would flicker back into view for a moment, incomplete and shimmering and real. That is the Analects. That is precisely what the Analects is. It is the scattered, treasured, slightly disagreeing memories of a group of people who loved the same old teacher, gathered up so that the flicker of him would not go out when they did. And so a book that could have been dry, a book of an ancient foreign moralist's rules, turns out, once you understand how it was made, to be one of the most quietly human documents there is. It is not a system handed down from on high, it is a collective act of remembering. It is people refusing to let a voice go silent. Every the master said is somebody, somewhere, years after the funeral saying, "Do you remember? He used to tell us," and then carefully, lovingly repeating the words so they would not be lost. The book is, in the truest sense, a book made by mourners, made by people who missed him. And you can feel that, once you know it. You can feel the missing in it. You can feel the care. We will spend the coming hours letting that man flicker back into view, slowly, one remembered fragment at a time. We will meet the students who did the remembering, the brilliant, poor young favourite who died too soon, and the brave, blunt one who was always being corrected, and the eloquent one who kept a hut by the grave far longer than he had to, unwilling to leave. We will hear a few of the actual sayings, read slowly, one at a time, with whatever little we know of the settings they came from, so they are not slogans on a card, but things a person once said to another person on an ordinary day. We will follow the old man himself out onto the road in the long, wandering, largely failed years of his life, when he went from small state to small state looking for a single ruler who would listen to him, and did not find one, and came home and taught. And we will arrive, near the end, at the quietest and largest thought of all, the one about what any life leaves behind, and how a set of remembered remarks turns out to be exactly that. But none of that is for right now. Right now there is only this, a dark room, a slow voice, the weight of your own resting body, and one gentle fact to fall asleep against. He wrote none of it. Everything that has travelled all this way to reach you tonight, everything the world thinks it knows of this man, survives only because some people, a very long time ago, could not bear to forget the things he said. And they remembered, and they passed the remembering on. And here it is, still, reaching you, in the dark, at whatever hour it is where you are lying. Let your breath go slow again. There is nothing to do with any of this. There is nowhere to be. The book waited more than 2,000 years to reach this night. It is in no hurry now, and neither are you. Let the words come and go, like the tide coming in over sand, smoothing everything as it goes, taking the day's marks with it as it draws back out. Let yourself be one of the people the old teacher never met, listening anyway, catching what you can, letting the rest drift by. And we will go on gently from here, in a moment, into the story of the ones who remembered him. So, the ones who remembered him. There were many of them. That is the first thing to understand, and it is also, when you sit with it, a quietly astonishing thing. He was not remembered by one careful scholar who sat down at a desk with ink and a plan. He was remembered by many people, in many places, at many different times, each of whom held a different part of him, a different afternoon, a different reply, a different look on his face, when a question pleased him or a question made him sad. They held their pieces the way you hold a thing you cannot bear to lose, which is to say imperfectly, and with great love, and for as long as they could. And then they passed the pieces on. That chain of passing on is the hidden spine of the book. It did not end with the first students. The first students grew old and died, as people do. And before they died, they spoke to their own students, and those students carried what they had heard into their own lives, their own small states, their own students, their own old age. The book the world now calls the Analects is not, then, a record kept by one person in 1 year. Scholars who have looked very carefully at its structure, and there are scholars who have spent whole lifetimes doing nothing else, believe it grew in layers, over many decades, the way a tree grows in rings, so that you can almost tell the older parts from the newer parts by the way they feel, the oldest sections denser and shorter, the later sections slightly smoother, as if time had softened something. This is a scholarly hypothesis and not a settled verdict, but even as a hypothesis, it rings true to the experience of reading the book, which does feel like a place that was built slowly, added to gradually, by people who were not always working from the same original notes. By the time anything resembling the received text, the version we read today, was fixed and settled, it was the Han dynasty. And the Han dynasty came centuries after 479 BCE, the year Confucius died in the state of Lu. Centuries, whatever political world he had navigated, whatever roads he had walked, whatever rulers had disappointed him. All of that was already ancient history by the time scribes sat down in the Han court to reconcile the competing versions of what he had said. There were competing versions, because there had been competing memories. Different schools kept different fragments. Different disciples had emphasized different things, harmonizing them, deciding what to include and in what order. Choosing the 20 books and their abrupt entries, this was editorial labor, and it was done by people several generations removed from the man they were trying to preserve. Breathe slowly here. Notice, if you like, the weight of the blanket or the sheet. Notice the air moving in through your nose and then leaving. And when you are ready, we will continue. All of this matters because it explains something about the experience of reading the book, which is strange if you have not been warned and immediately recognizable if you have. It is strange in the same way that overhearing a conversation in another room is strange. You catch a sentence. You lose the next one. Then you catch another sentence that seems to come from a different part of a different exchange, and you cannot tell how much time has passed between the two. The Analects reads exactly like this. The master said, and then one remark, and then silence. The master said, and then something that seems to come from a completely different occasion, with no bridge between them and no explanation of what caused either. You are not reading an argument. You are not even reading a book in the ordinary sense. You are reading the notebook of people who loved someone, which is one of the most fragmentary kinds of document there is, because love does not organize itself in chapters. And yet something comes through, something consistent and particular and recognizable. The voice, across all those gaps and silences and missing occasions, is the same voice, a little impatient sometimes, grieving sometimes, capable of a dry, warm humour that shows up without announcement and then disappears before you quite catch it, troubled by the distance between what people say they value and what they actually do, unwilling to let certain words, good words, serious words, be used carelessly, and always circling back to the same question, which is roughly, what would it actually mean to be a decent person, not in theory, but on this particular afternoon, in this particular relationship, with this particular person in front of you? Take a slow breath. You do not need to hold any of this. You do not need to memorize it or understand it fully. Let it come in and let it go like the tide. The central word of the book is ren. Written with the character that places a person next to the number two, the human and the other, joined, it is usually translated as humaneness or human-heartedness or benevolence. None of those translations is wrong, exactly. All of them miss something. Because what the word points to is not a concept but a practice, and the practice is too alive to fit tidily into a single English equivalent. But here is the thing about ren in the Analects that makes it genuinely surprising. Once you know to look for it, Confucius almost never says the same thing about it twice. He is asked again and again by different disciples what ren is, and he gives different answers every time. Not wildly different answers. The underlying thing he is pointing at holds steady, the way a lantern holds steady, even when you look at it from different angles. But the angle matters. He does not say, to everyone who asks, the same sentences. He says, to each person who asks, the sentences that person needs to hear. Yan Hui, the beloved student, the brilliant one, the poor one whose rice bowl was always nearly empty and who went on living thoughtfully anyway, Yan Hui asks about ren. And Confucius says something like, to master oneself and return to propriety, to put aside what is personal and small and to return to what is proper and shared. But when Yan Yuan presses and asks how you do that, the answer is concrete. Do not look at what is contrary to propriety. Do not listen to it. Do not speak it. Do not move by it. 4 things. Very specific. He is giving his most gifted student the most demanding answer, because his most gifted student can hold it. To another disciple, to Shandong, who asks the same question on a different day, the answer is different. Here the words become, do not do to others what you would not want done to yourself. Work without grievance in the great offices and in the small ones alike. The bar is set at a different height, set for a different person, and the same word, ren, is being unfolded from a different face. This is not inconsistency. Or rather, it is the kind of inconsistency that is also the deepest form of consistency, the kind that treats each person as genuinely different and therefore genuinely deserving of a different answer. A doctor does not give every patient the same treatment and call that care. Confucius does not give every student the same sentence and call that teaching. The word stays steady. The teaching breathes. And this is why the book preserves the variation rather than resolving it. Whoever assembled the Analects could have harmonized these different answers, could have chosen one and let the others go, or could have averaged them into a single tidy definition. They did not. They kept the different answers, and in keeping them they kept the different days, the different people, the different needs. The book is full of these small, contradictory seeming kindnesses. This is not a bug in the text. It is, in its way, the whole point. Let yourself rest a moment here. You do not need to know what ren means before you sleep. It is enough to know that he kept giving different answers, and that each one was meant for a specific person on a specific day. That is already something. Take a breath now. A slow one. Notice the quiet, or whatever sounds are underneath the quiet where you are. and when you are ready, let us go on. There is another word the book cares deeply about, and it sounds, on first hearing, like it might not be interesting at all. The word is li. Ritual, propriety, the right way to do things. It sounds like the word for ceremony, for formal dress, for the stiff and official. And there is ritual in it. The Analects is full of passages about how to mourn correctly, how to stand when you enter a room, how to comport yourself in the presence of the ruler. These passages can seem distant, the concern of a particular world very far from a dark bedroom in the present. But here is what Confucius means by li. Underneath the ceremonies, he means the visible skin of inner decency. He means that how you do things, the care you put into a small gesture, the attention you bring to a greeting, the effort of standing correctly in a moment of grief, is not separate from what you feel inside. It is the feeling, made visible. Ritual, in his understanding, is not performance, it is practice. And practice, over time, becomes the person. There is a passage in the book where a disciple named Lin Fang asks about the root of li, not the details, but the root, the underlying thing. And Confucius answers with something that sounds almost like a sigh of relief, a good question, a real question. And then he says that in ceremonies it is better to be simple than extravagant, and that in mourning it is better to grieve truly than to perform grief correctly with a hollow heart. The root is the feeling. The ritual is the shape the feeling wears in the world. He was a great lover of music, the book tells us in many places. He wept at certain pieces of music. He went without meat for 3 months once, tradition says, after hearing a particular piece of the old Zhou music. Overwhelmed, he said, that music had reached such a height. He cared about the forms, not because the forms were ends in themselves, but because the forms were how a community of people agreed, together, on what mattered. When everyone stands a certain way at a certain moment, they are not simply following a rule, they are, in that moment, together, honouring the same thing. The ritual is the agreement, made physical, and the agreement matters because people need to agree on something beyond their own private appetites, or they lose each other. This is what li meant to him, not stiffness, not empty ceremony. The shared form by which inner life becomes visible and visible life becomes shared. Breathe, you are doing exactly what you need to do, which is nothing at all. Just lying here, letting this come. Now, Zigong. Zigong, his full name Duan Muqi, was one of the most capable of the disciples, eloquent and practically gifted in the way that made him successful in the world, in ways Confucius himself never quite was. He was a diplomat. He was, by some accounts, a prosperous trader. He was good with words. And he was devoted. He comes to Confucius in one of the passages and asks a question that is different in shape from the questions about Ren. Because Zigong is already sophisticated enough to know that he needs something he can actually use. He does not ask what goodness is in the abstract. He asks, and this is the version in the Lao translation, which is one of the 2 English translations that most American readers know. He asks, is there one word which can serve as a guide to one's entire life? One word, practical, specific, the question of someone who wants something to hold, not something to contemplate. And Confucius says the word is shu, reciprocity, and then he unpacks it in one sentence, a sentence that has become one of the most recognized in the entire book, though the book itself is not always well known. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. In Chinese, the formulation is remarkably tight. What you yourself do not want, do not put it on others. the negative form of what you might call the golden rule, not do to others as you would have them do to you, which asks for a kind of positive, sometimes presumptuous, generosity, but the more careful, more modest version, at the very least, do not do to someone else what you know you would hate. The flaw, not the ceiling. He gave Zigong one word. Zigong asked for something that could guide an entire life, and the one word was, take yourself as the measure. Notice what hurts you, what diminishes you, what makes you feel unseen or overridden or used, and then do not do that thing to another person. That is the flaw of decency. Start there. Practice that in every relationship, on every ordinary day. It is not grand. It does not promise transformation or transcendence or a radiant life. It is a practice, and like all practices, it is harder than it sounds. You know very well what you do not want, to be dismissed, to be lied to be used as a means and not seen as a person. And yet it is entirely possible on an ordinary tired day to do to someone else the very thing you most hate being done to you. Without noticing, without meaning to. This is what the word asks you to notice. Breathe slowly. There is nothing you need to do with this tonight. Just let the word rest near you. Shu, reciprocity. One word that might take a lifetime. Take a slow breath. Let your face soften. You have been many things today, and it is over now, and you are just a body lying in the dark. And the old teacher's one-word answer is somewhere nearby in the quiet, and it does not ask anything of you right now. When you are ready, let us go on. There is a passage in the second book of the Analects, in what the standard numbering calls Book 2, verse 17, and it is one of those entries that arrives without context, no setting, no name of who was there. Just the phrase that begins every entry, Ziyue, the master said, and then the words themselves. The master said, to know what you know, and to know that you do not know what you do not know, that is knowledge. Read it slowly. Read it the way you might read something someone slipped under your door in the night, something short enough to be a little frightening in how much it fits into so few words. He is not saying, learn more. He is not giving you a curriculum or a system or a method. He is describing a posture, the posture of being honest with yourself about what you actually have and what you actually lack, which sounds simple and which is in practice perhaps the hardest single thing. Because what most of us do, much of the time, is something slightly different. We speak with a confidence that slightly exceeds our knowledge, because confidence is easier than the small humiliation of not knowing. We nod along when we do not fully follow, because following along is socially safer than admitting the gap. We mistake familiarity for understanding. We have heard the name, we recognize the outline, we have a rough sense of the shape, and we let that rough sense pass for knowledge, because to say I don't actually know, this requires a kind of courage that is rarely rewarded and often penalized. And so the shelf of things we do not know grows quietly, in the dark at the back, while the front-facing shelf, the things we present as understood, stays tidy and well lit and only partially true. What Confucius is pointing at in that single sentence is the freedom on the other side of this. To say I know this when you know it, and I do not know this when you do not. And to be genuinely comfortable doing both, this is a form of mental housekeeping that most people never fully achieve. But it is also, he seems to be saying, the precondition for actually learning anything. Because you cannot learn what you think you already know. The cup that believes it is full will not receive what is poured. There is something else underneath this passage, though it is not stated. A man who spent his whole adult life trying to persuade rulers to govern virtuously, a man who knew from long experience that his ideas were not being adopted, that the world was not being reformed, that the change he believed in was not coming in his lifetime, this man is also the one who said, "Know what you know. Know that you do not know what you do not know." It is possible to read this as a note to himself as much as an instruction to a disciple. A reminder to stay honest about what can be changed and what cannot. A practice of realism, not pessimism, the difference being that realism keeps the eyes open, while pessimism closes them in advance. Breathe. Breathe slowly. Notice the quiet of the room or the sounds underneath the quiet. Your breath going in and your breath going out. You know this room. You know this bed. You know this hour. The rest can wait until morning, and some of it will still not be knowable then. And that is not a failure. That is the ordinary condition of being alive. You do not need to remember this passage. If the words came in and softened something, that is enough. Let it rest. Take another slow breath. Let the chest rise and fall. And we will stay, for a little while longer, in the presence of these fragments. There is a quality to the book that only becomes fully apparent after you have spent time with it, a quality that is the opposite of what you might expect from something described as foundational, as a cornerstone of a civilization, as the text that shaped the examination system and the governance of a country for more than 1,000 years. The quality is smallness. Not smallness as a flaw, smallness as an honest scale. Each entry is small, each exchange is brief, each answer is specific and usually personal and rarely grand. You look for the system and you find instead an old man talking to a student about what it means to mourn correctly. Or another old man talking to a different student about the word that could guide an entire life. Or the master watching a student and thinking quietly that the student who never argued with him was not actually the passive one. The fragments are small because people are small, and because the conversations that actually shape us are almost never the ones that felt important while they were happening. He once said, Book 2, the early part of it, that at 15 he had set his heart on learning. Not that learning had come to him, not that a teacher had found him and recognized his gifts, but that he himself, at 15, a young boy in the state of Lu, in the middle of a very turbulent century, had turned toward learning the way a plant turns toward light. Chosen it, wanted it, and then spent the rest of his life, in his own careful account, slowly becoming someone who could finally, at 70, follow his own heart without going wrong. 55 years between the wanting and the being. And that is the life of the man the world calls its great teacher. Breathe. There is nothing you need to become tonight. There is no step you need to take right now. You are lying here, and the words are coming in, and some of them will drift away with sleep, and some of them will stay in a way you will not quite be able to identify in the morning. That is fine. That is, perhaps, how the best things stay. Breathe slowly. The room is the same room it was. The quiet is the same quiet. Your body knows what to do. Let it. And there is more. There is the matter of who did the remembering. In more specific terms, there are the particular faces of the people who loved him and held his words in their hands like water they were trying not to spill. There is Yan Hui and Zilu and Zigong's long vigil by the grave. There is Zhengzi's daily habit of asking himself 3 questions. There is the word that quietly rewrote who counts as noble, and the question about life and death that he refused to answer in the way it was asked. All of this is waiting. All of it will come. But for now, for this small pause between one part of the story and the next, let yourself simply be here. Let the weight of the book settle around you like a quilt that is old and soft and does not ask anything of you. The words were spoken. They were remembered. They were passed on. They have come a very long way to find you in this room, at this hour, in whatever season it is where you are lying. You do not need to do anything with them. You are already doing the only thing that matters, which is simply staying here, in the dark, in the quiet, breathing. Take one more slow breath. In, through the nose, and slowly out. When you are ready, only when you are ready, we will go on into the story of the people who loved him. They did the remembering. That is the answer. Ordinary people who loved him, who sat near him, who watched the way he ate and mourned and corrected himself, who listened when he spoke and found, afterward, that they could not let the words go. The disciples, and then, when the disciples grew old and died, the disciples of those disciples. Generation to generation, holding the sentences up to the light to make sure they had not lost their shape. That is how the book survived before it was a book. Not in ink, in mouths, in the careful memory of people who were afraid to misquote someone they missed. The words moved through decades that way, through the slow turn of seasons in the small state of Lu, through grief and civil unrest and the ordinary passage of time that does not pause for what is precious. And when the Han dynasty, centuries after Confucius had died, centuries, not years, when Han scholars finally gathered the various versions and the competing fragments and reconciled what they could into something close to the text we have now, they were not making a new thing. They were setting in stone what memory had already been keeping for a very long time. Think of that. Think of how long a chain of hands that is. A word spoken in 480 BC, remembered by a student, taught to another student, held by that student's students, passed through centuries of war and forgetting and imperfect recollection, until eventually it reached scholars who wrote it down with brushes on bamboo strips in a dynasty that was itself already ancient. And then it reached a printer and a translator, and eventually a voice reading to you in the dark of wherever you are tonight. The word travelled a very long way to reach this room. Let yourself feel how quiet that is. How improbable. Not a monument that survived. Those survive by being stone. This survived because people kept caring whether it was remembered correctly. That is a different kind of survival. It is the kind that costs something. Take a slow breath, in and out. The room is still. There is nothing you need to do but listen, and not even that. If you drift, the words will be here when you surface, or they will not, and either way you will have rested. Now, the question of goodness. There is an entry in the Analects, not one entry actually, but several, where a disciple asks Confucius about Ren, the word that sits at the center of everything. Humaneness, human-heartedness. The quality of being genuinely good to the people around you, not as performance, not as strategy, but as the thing your nature is quietly moving toward when nothing is in the way. Different disciples asked the question, and they got different answers. This surprised people. Later it bothered some readers. If Ren is one thing, why does the master say several different things about it to several different people? Is he contradicting himself? Is the text corrupted? Did the people who assembled it make a mistake? But the answer is simpler than that, and more human. Each man who asked had a particular flaw, a particular shape of insufficiency. One was impulsive and needed to be told to hold back. One was timid and needed to be told to step forward. One was proud and needed to hear something that would quiet the pride without breaking the person. The master answered the question he was actually being asked, which was not always the question the words said. We do this too, if we are paying attention. The person in front of us determines what part of the truth they need. Not the whole truth, not always, not delivered all at once, but the piece of it that they can use. That is also a kind of humaneness. That is also Ren, practiced in the act of teaching. And the book preserves the variation. It does not harmonize the answers into one tidy definition. It keeps them all, the different days, the different men, the different moments of need, and lets you see the shape of a teacher who was always watching, who was actually sitting in front of him. Let us stay with Ren a moment longer, and with Li, its companion. Li is sometimes translated as ritual, sometimes as propriety or ceremony or the right way to do things. It means the proper form, how you stand, how you greet someone, how you mourn, how you bow, how you carry yourself at a state occasion, and also at an ordinary meal. It sounds cold when you say it quickly. It sounds like rules for the sake of rules. It sounds like the kind of thing that gets emptied out until only the husk remains. Confucius did not think it was the husk. He thought it was the skin of something living. He thought that when you perform a ritual correctly, when you really perform it, with the attention it asks, you are not displaying an empty form. You are practicing an inner reality in the world where it can be seen. You are making your decency visible. You are giving it a shape that other people can recognize and trust. It is something like the way a long marriage has its rituals, the particular way one person makes tea for the other, the small acknowledgements that become almost ceremonial over time. These are not empty. They are love, made reliable and repeatable. They are Ren, given a form by Li. Breathe in through the nose, slowly out through the mouth. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. Notice the particular quality of the darkness behind your closed eyes. There is nothing to figure out. This is only a voice, and an old book, and a quiet room. Now there is a disciple named Zigong. He was eloquent, quick, capable, a diplomat, and, by most accounts, a man of real skill in the world. He once asked the master, if I had to take a single word and practice it for the rest of my life, what would that word be? A whole life. One word, and Confucius said, shu. Reciprocity, the word that contains the negative golden rule. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. Do not do to them what you would not want done to you. That is shu. That is the one word. It is a negative formulation, and that matters. Not do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the positive instruction, which requires you to know what others want and to go actively toward it. This is quieter. This is, before you act, stop, ask what you would not want. And then do not do that. It is a practice of restraint before it is a practice of generosity. It is the small check that happens in the space between impulse and action. Zigong was given the word for his whole life. One word. That is what the master thought was enough, and also sufficient to orient a person if they actually practiced it. And now one more. There is a line in Book 2 of the Analects, and it goes like this: to say you know when you know, and to say you do not when you do not, that is knowledge. The master said that. Someone remembered it. Someone passed it on. And here it is, 2,500 years later, arriving in a room where you are lying in the dark, perhaps not quite certain of anything, perhaps carrying the familiar feeling of a mind that spins and grasps and reassembles itself in the night. You do not need to know very much. You do not need to know what tomorrow holds, or what you should have done differently, or whether you are getting any of it right. You need only to know what you know and say so, and to know what you don't and say so too. That is enough to be called knowing. The master said so, and someone loved him enough to remember it, and now it is here with you. Take a slow, deep breath. You have been listening for a while now, and perhaps some of what came before has already begun to settle. The way things settle in a room when the lights go out and the air stops moving. You do not need to hold any of it. You do not need to carry the word shoe into tomorrow, or remember which book number anything came from, or check whether you have been practicing restraint in the space between impulse and action. You can simply let the words continue to arrive. That is all that is asked of you here. When you are ready, we will go a little further. Because there is something the book has not yet shown us, and it matters. The Analects is not only a record of what the master said, it is also, quietly, a record of the people who loved him. Their names are in it. Their questions are in it. Their particular habits, their bravery and their foolishness and their grief are preserved inside the book because they were the ones who did the preserving. And when you read it slowly, when you listen to it the way you might listen to someone describing a person they once knew well, you begin to understand something about the book that you cannot get from a summary. The people who remembered him were not recording history. They were mourning. And the things you remember about someone you love are not the things you would plan to remember. They are the things that stayed. The particular remark. The moment of unexpected tenderness. The afternoon when he scolded you, and you knew he was right, and you were grateful even through the sting. The morning when he wept and did not try to stop himself. These are the things that make it into a book like this, and these are the things we are going to sit with now, one at a time, in the dark. Let us begin with Yan Hui. His full name was Yan Yuan, but the book calls him Yan Hui. He was the master's favorite student, and the book does not try to hide that. It does not present the master as impartially distributed among his disciples. The fondness is there in the text, plain and a little startling if you are not expecting it. What the book says about Yan Hui is this. He was poor. Not uncomfortable poor, but poor in the way that is a daily material fact, a single bowl of rice, a gourd of water to drink, a lane in a poor quarter of the city. These are the details the text gives, and it gives them not as tragedy, but almost as a clarification. This is the condition of the person we are describing, and yet, the book says, he did not let it change his joy. That is a strange thing to say about a young man living in near destitution. It is also the thing that made the master love him. There is an entry, someone remembered it, someone passed it on, in which the master looks at Yan Hui and says, he is almost there. He goes 3 months without letting his heart stray from humaneness. The others manage a day, maybe a month. And then it slips. 3 months. The master is not saying Yan Hui is perfect. He is saying 3 months is how long Yan Hui manages to hold it. This quality of Ren, this genuine goodness in his inner life. before some ordinary pressure of being a person causes it to slip. And 3 months is, apparently, remarkable. The other students manage a day, maybe a month. Then they forget. This is the texture of what the master watched for. Not great, dramatic moral choices, not whether his students would die for a principle or give away everything they had. He was watching the ordinary weeks. 3 months of keeping your heart in the right place. That was what he saw in Yan Hui, and that was why he loved him. And then Yan Hui died. The book records this moment, and it does not soften it. The master cried. He cried in a way that alarmed the people around him, the way extreme grief alarms people who are watching it happen. And one of the attendants said, "Master, your grief is excessive." And he said, "Is it? If not for this man, for whom should I grieve?" He used the word heaven. He said, "Heaven has bereft me. Heaven has bereft me." That is not a composed philosophical statement. That is a man in grief, speaking the way people speak when something has been taken from them and the enormity of the absence has not yet resolved into something manageable. He did not say Yan Hui was the best student, or that his death was a loss to the teaching. He said, "Heaven has bereft me." A personal devastation claimed without apology. Someone was there when he said it. Someone remembered it, and they put it in the book. Let us pause here. Take a slow breath. If your body has been holding some small tension, let it soften now. You do not need to do anything with the image of that grief. You can simply let it be what it is, an old record of a man weeping for someone he loved, and let it rest somewhere quiet inside you. And breathe. When you are ready, we will continue. There was another student, very different from Yan Hui, and he also has a place in this book and in the memory of the people who made it. His name was Zilu. His formal name was Zhongyo, but the book calls him Zilu, and when you read enough of the Analects, you begin to recognize him the way you recognize a particular kind of person, the one in every classroom, in every group, in every gathering, who says what he thinks before he has finished thinking it. The brave one, the loyal one, the one who gets it wrong and does not particularly mind being told so, and then gets it wrong again, in a slightly different direction. The book is full of Zilu being corrected. There is an entry where Zilu asks about strength. The master says, "Do you want southern strength, northern strength, or the strength of the exemplary person?" And then explains that the exemplary person's strength is not the strength of armies or endurance, but of standing firm inside right conduct. Zilu is probably the one asking about strength, because strength is what he understands. He is that kind of person. There is an entry where he asks whether the master would go to war with him by his side, and the master says, gently but unmistakably, no. With someone who knows how to be careful with his own life, not someone who dies without regret. That is a soft scolding. It does not land as cruelty. It lands as the kind of honest assessment you can only receive from someone who has looked at you long enough to know you, and who says the difficult thing because it is true, not because they want to wound. Zilu was corrected a great many times, and he kept coming back. And then he died, far from home, in the state of Wei, in the violence of a political coup, the kind of messy historical turbulence that the Analects mostly keeps at arm's length, because the book is not concerned with wars and coups, it is concerned with how to live inside them. Zilu died in that violence, and tradition holds that when the master heard the circumstances of his death, heard the particular manner of it, he was shattered. The word used is shattered. He had known this student for most of his adult life. He had corrected him more times than anyone could count, and he wept for him the way he had wept for Yan Hui, though for different reasons and probably in a different register. Yan Hui's death was the loss of the one who had gotten closest to the thing the master was teaching. Zilu's death was something else, something more personal and tangled. The death of someone you have been arguing with your whole life, someone you have been trying to reach for decades, someone whose courage you love and whose recklessness frightens you, someone who kept showing up. The book preserves both griefs. It does not choose between them. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your body find whatever position it has already found, and let it rest there. The names can settle. Yan Hui. Zilu, they were real people who loved a teacher and kept what they could of him. And then they were gone too, and others carried the memory forward. When you are ready. There was a third student, and he is different from the other two. And the thing the book records about him comes after the master died, not during the years of teaching. His name was Zigong, formal name Duan Mu Chi. He appears often in the Analects. He is the one who was given the word shu, that single word reciprocity, do not do to others what you would not want done to you. He was eloquent, which is a quality the master had a complicated relationship with. The book records more than once that fine words and an ingratiating face are seldom accompanied by true humaneness. And yet Zigong, who was eloquent, who was also a successful merchant and diplomat, clearly held an important place in the master's world. The master answered his questions carefully. He asked hard questions. He pushed. But what the book records of Zigong, the detail that has travelled down 2,500 years and arrives here in this room with you tonight, is this. When the master died, the ritual mourning period was 3 years. That was the expected practice. 3 years of formal grief, the period prescribed for the death of a parent, which is the deepest mourning the tradition asks for. 3 years. And after 3 years, the other disciples gathered up their grief and went back to their lives. Zigong stayed. He stayed at the grave for 6 years, twice what was asked. 3 years beyond what anyone required of him, 3 years of sitting near the burial mound, maintaining the mourning hut. Alone. This is not in the Analects directly. It comes from later tradition, from Sima Qian's account, written centuries after. So it carries the weight of a reported memory rather than a transcribed remark. But it has been carried, and the reason it has been carried is probably because it has the texture of something true. Not necessarily literally true, but true to what the relationship was. There are some losses after which the prescribed amount of time is not enough, and the person who has suffered the loss simply keeps going because they do not know how to stop. 6 years at the grave. What do you do for 6 years at a grave? You remember. You go back over what was said and what you wish you had said. You sit with the absence and feel its specific shape. You think about the questions you would still like to ask. You carry on a conversation that has no more replies. There is something in this that is not only about Zigong and the master. There is something here about what we do with the people we love when they are gone, the long staying near, the unwillingness to let the calendar decide when the grief is finished. Zigong, the eloquent one, the successful one, the one who received a single word to live by, he stayed. And the book that carries his name carries also, implicitly, that staying. The whole Analects is a kind of staying near. The disciples did not go back to their lives and leave the master in the past. They wrote down, eventually, slowly, across generations, what they remembered of him. The book is the other form of 6 years at the grave. Take a slow breath here, let that settle. The book as a kind of staying near, the record as the shape of the grief. And when you are ready, one more. There was a student named Zhengzi. His formal name was Zheng Shen. He appears in the Analects in connection with something that is easy to overlook because it sounds, on the surface, like a method, a daily checklist, a practice of self-review. But when you slow down with it, when you let it arrive at its own pace, it is not a checklist, it is something quieter than that. The book records Zhengzi saying, "Each day I examine myself on 3 points. In serving others, have I been faithful? In my dealings with friends, have I been sincere? Have I mastered and practiced what I was taught?" 3 questions. Every day. Not 3 rules to follow. 3 questions to ask. There is a difference, and it is not a small one. A rule tells you what to do before you have done anything. A question asks you to look back honestly at what you actually did. One is a standard you try to meet. The other is a practice of honest seeing, conducted daily, before you go to sleep. Have I been faithful in serving others? Not did I do everything perfectly. Not was I better than yesterday. Not did I make progress. Have I been faithful? Did I bring what was genuinely mine to give, and give it honestly, even when it was inconvenient, even when nobody would have noticed if I had given less? Have I been sincere with my friends? Not charming, not pleasant, not helpful in visible ways. Sincere, did I say what I actually meant? Did I withhold something I should have said? Did I agree when I did not agree, and smile when I did not feel it, because agreement and smiling were easier? Have I mastered and practiced what I was taught? Not memorized, mastered and practiced. Have I actually lived it, or only known it in the way you know something, when you have understood it without yet letting it change anything? These are not easy questions to answer yes to. They may not be questions you are meant to answer yes to every day. The examination is the practice, not the outcome. Zhengzi examined himself every day, not because he had failed spectacularly and needed to make an accounting, but because the ordinary daily life of a person is full of small moments in which faithfulness or sincerity or practice either happened or did not, and the only way to stay honest about it is to look, not harshly, not with the cruelty of a prosecutor reviewing evidence, with the plain, quiet attention of someone who wants to know what actually happened inside them today before they sleep. You might find, lying here in the dark, that this kind of looking is already familiar to you. The mind at night often turns back over the day, the conversation you handled badly, the thing you should have said and didn't, the small unkindness you let pass because it was easier, the moment you were not quite present. The mind does this on its own, sometimes in ways that feel punishing rather than useful. What Zhengzi is describing is not the punishing version, it is something more like a gentle inventory. And the fact that it is only 3 questions is important. Not everything, not a full accounting. 3 things. Tonight did I bring faithfulness, sincerity and practice? Those 3. If the answer is yes, good. If the answer is no, that is useful to know. Tomorrow is still there. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has begun to soften in your body. Your shoulders, perhaps, the muscles along your jaw. You do not need to answer Zhengzi's 3 questions tonight. But if they arrive in you quietly, in the next few minutes, that is all right. Let them arrive. You do not need to pursue them, only to let them come and let them go. When you are ready, we will continue. The students and their questions are part of what makes the book alive, and there is something the book itself is doing, quietly, that runs underneath all of those exchanges. A redefinition, not announced, not argued for in any systematic way, just gradually, entry by entry, across 20 books, performed. The word is junzi. In Chinese before Confucius, the word junzi meant the son of a lord, a birth rank, a fact about your father. You were a junzi if you came from the right family, and if you did not come from the right family. No amount of learning or goodness or effort made you one. The category was closed. It was determined before you were old enough to do anything with your life. The Analects uses the word constantly. It is the word the master reaches for when he wants to describe the kind of person he is trying to cultivate. The exemplary person, the good person, the person who has developed the inner qualities that make a human life worth living. And over the course of the book, almost without being said explicitly, the definition has shifted. Junzi no longer means your father's rank. It means what you have made of yourself. This is not a small change. This is one of the quietest and most consequential moves in the whole book. A person born to nothing could be a junzi. A person born to everything could fail to be one. The work was the thing, the daily effort of examining yourself, of practicing what you had been taught, of returning again and again to the qualities of faithfulness and sincerity and genuine care. Birth could not grant these things, and birth could not take them away. They were earned, or they were not, through the actual living of a life. The book does not make a dramatic announcement of this. It does not say, "We are hereby overturning the old order." It simply uses the word differently and keeps using it differently, and after a while, the old meaning has been quietly replaced by the new one. This is how the most durable changes often happen. Not as declarations, as habits of speech that shift the way people think about what matters. You are a junzi not because of what you were given. You are one because of what you do with what you were given. Because of whether you examine yourself and practice and try again tomorrow. The birth is the least interesting fact about you. Let us explore a story about this. There was a young man who came from a family of modest means in a city that cared very much about who your family was. He was clever, and he knew it, and for a while the cleverness was the thing he trusted, the quickness of his mind, his ability to say the right thing in a conversation, to answer a question faster than anyone else in the room. He thought that this was what the master valued, because it was what everyone he had grown up around valued. He asked early on what it meant to be a junzi. The master looked at him and said, "If your words exceed your actions, then I am embarrassed for you." That was not the answer he expected. He had thought the question would be answered with equality, with courage or learning or wisdom. He had not thought it would be answered by pointing, quietly and without cruelty, at the gap between what he said and what he did. He went away and thought about it for a long time. He kept coming back. He asked harder questions. He started to watch the distance between the words he spoke and the life he actually lived, and he found the distance was larger than he had understood. This was uncomfortable. He did not stop watching. Many years later, after the master had died, this young man was known as someone whose words and life had come closer together. Not perfectly aligned, nobody is perfectly aligned, but closer. He had spent the intervening years doing the work that the master had pointed him toward, the work of reducing the gap, of meaning what you say and saying what you mean, and living in a way that is consistent with both. He had not been born into the right family, he had become a junzi. These were not the same thing, and in the world of the Analects, only the second one mattered. Let us pause here. Take a breath. Let your body settle. The word Junzi, born meaning one thing, meaning another by the time the book was finished. That kind of quiet change is everywhere in this text, not announced, just present. When you are ready. There is another passage, and it is the kind of passage that sounds abstract until you have thought about it for a moment, and then it sounds like something very plain and very practical. The master was asked what should come first in governing a state. And he said, the rectification of names. Zhengming, the rectification of names. His questioner was startled. This seemed like an odd priority for a statesman. Shouldn't you attend to the army, or the treasury, or the people's welfare? Why names? The master's answer, someone remembered it, someone passed it on, goes something like this. If names are not correct, language does not accord with truth. If language does not accord with truth, affairs cannot be accomplished. If affairs cannot be accomplished, ritual and music will not flourish. If ritual and music do not flourish, punishments will not be appropriate. If punishments are not appropriate, the people will not know where to put their hands and feet. This is a long chain of consequence, starting from a small place, the place where a word and a thing stop matching each other. What does it mean practically? It means this. If the man who rules is not actually ruling, if he holds the title of ruler but makes decisions out of fear or self-interest or negligence rather than out of genuine care for the people, then the word ruler no longer fits what he is, and everything built on the assumption that he is a ruler starts to go wrong. If the father in a family does not actually father, does not protect, does not guide, does not show up, then calling him a father is a kind of lie that the whole family is required to maintain. And the maintenance of that lie costs something. It costs the children the truth of their situation. It costs the family the ability to see and address what is actually happening. Zhengming is the insistence that words should mean what they mean, and that when they don't, the first step is to fix the words, not to change the labels for convenience. To make the label true, which means making the conduct true. If you want to be called a good person, be one. If you want to be called a faithful friend, be faithful. If you want the name, do the thing. It is a demanding idea, stated with no apology. The master knew that words drift. He knew that people use words to cover what they are not doing, to perform the appearance of something rather than its substance. He had watched rulers who were not ruling. He had watched relationships that carried names, parent, friend, official, that did not carry the qualities those names were supposed to describe. And his answer was not to become cynical about the names, but to insist on them. To take the names seriously enough to require that the lives inside them be made to match. There is something here about your own life if you want to bring it there. Not as a demand, not as a new item for Zhengzi's 3 questions, but as a quiet observation. The names we carry, husband, wife, friend, parent, neighbour, colleague, the gap between the name and the life. The work of reducing that gap is the work Zhengming is pointing at, and it is, the master says, the work on which everything else depends. The society that cannot name things accurately cannot fix them. The person who cannot be honest about who they are and who they are not cannot begin to close the gap, rectify the names, make them true. That is where it starts. Let us pause here. Take a slow breath. Let your body relax a little more deeply than it has been, the rectification of names. It is a very old idea, and it still sounds, if you let it, like something worth knowing. And when you are ready, there is one more thing the book says, and it is the strangest thing the master says, and also, perhaps, the truest. Someone asked him about death. This is not a strange question to ask a teacher who is concerned with how to live a good life. Death is the destination that shadows all the other questions. What does it mean to live well? Knowing that the living ends. What happens afterward? Are the spirits of the dead present? Should we attend to them, fear them, pray to them? The master's answer is brief. Briefer than almost anything else he says on any subject. He says, "You do not yet know life. How can you know death?" That is the whole answer. There is no doctrine here, no afterlife described, no careful theology of what awaits. The man who has spent his life thinking about how to live, who has offered careful and detailed accounts of ritual and virtue and the qualities of the exemplary person, when asked about death, he steps back. He declines to speculate. He says, "You have not finished learning about this. Start there." It is, in its way, the most honest thing in the book, the most intellectually humble. He does not know what death is. He knows that he does not know, and so he does not say. There is a related remark, almost in the same neighborhood of the book. Someone asks about serving the spirits, the ancestral spirits, the spirits of the dead, who, in the tradition of that time and place, were understood to be present in some way, requiring ceremony and attention. And the master says, "Respect the spirits, and keep them at a distance." That is all. Respect them, and keep them at a distance. This is not dismissal. He is not saying the spirits do not exist or do not matter. He is saying, give them the reverence they are owed. And then return to the living world, which is where you are and where the work is. Do not live your life in anxious negotiation with what is beyond the edge of what you can know. Respect it, and attend primarily to what is here. The master, who was himself not yet finished with goodness, who had not yet managed a single day of full humaneness when he died, understood that the living world was hard enough. He understood that the questions of how to treat the person in front of you, how to fulfill the name you carry, how to be faithful and sincere in the ordinary texture of an ordinary day, these questions were not simple. They were not finished. He had given his whole life to them and had not finished. The territory of the living was enough to occupy a lifetime. Death could wait. And there is something in this, something the book is doing, by including these two brief answers among all the longer and more expansive ones, that is gently, plainly human. He did not have everything figured out. He was not reporting from the far shore of enlightenment. He was a person who had thought carefully about how to live, who had come to some useful understandings, who had shared them as honestly as he could, and who knew the edges of what he knew. The edge of what he knew was death. And there he stopped. Someone was there when he stopped. Someone remembered the stopping, and the stopping went into the book, as honestly as everything else. Let us pause here for a longer moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your chest rise and let it fall. Let your hands be wherever they are, loose and warm. You do not need to know very much tonight. You do not need to know what comes next, or what tomorrow is going to ask of you, or whether you are getting any of it right. You know what you know, and you know what you don't, and both of those are enough. The people who loved him are all in the book. Yan Hui, who went 3 months without letting his heart stray, and died young and left the master saying, "Heaven has bereft me." Zilu, brave and blunt and corrected 1,000 times, who died far away in someone else's war. Zigong, the eloquent one, who stayed 6 years when the ritual asked for 3, because 3 years was not enough time to finish grieving. Zhengzi, who asked himself every night whether he had been faithful, sincere, and present. Each of them carried something of the master in the direction of the future, and the things they carried are still arriving. The man at the center of all of it had redefined what goodness meant. He had said quietly, entry by entry, that the son of a lord was no more a Junzi than anyone else by virtue of the birth, that the word belonged to the life and not to the bloodline. He had said that the first task of a well-ordered world was to make the words true, to close the gap between names and things. To stop calling a father if he was not fathering, to stop calling a ruler if he was not ruling. He had said that learning was a pleasure, and that a friend arriving from far away was a joy, and that not knowing what you don't know is its own kind of wisdom. He had said that he had not managed it, not fully, not in himself, not in any single day he could point to and say, "Today I had it." He had said all of these things in passing over the course of a life, and the people who loved him had listened and remembered what they could. And that is how the book was made. Let us pause here for a moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Notice the weight of your body where you are resting. Notice how the quiet has settled around you. There is nothing you need to do with any of this. You are just listening. When you are ready, we will continue together. We have been sitting with the people who loved him. And now we turn, gently, to the man himself. Not the idea of him. Not the doctrine or the tradition or the long shadow that fell across 2,000 years. The man, Confucius, of the state of Lu, in what is now Shandong province, near the town of Qufu. The man who was later called Confucius, Master Kong, and whose name the Jesuits, centuries after his death, carried back to Europe and rendered into Latin as Confucius. He was born, by tradition, in 551 BC. He died in 479 BC. Those 72 years are the frame. Inside the frame is a life that did not look, from the outside, like the life of the most consequential teacher in Chinese history. It looked, for much of its length, like the life of a man who was trying to be useful and could not quite manage it. He was not a king. He was not wealthy. He held no lasting high office. He wanted one. That wanting and the not getting is written all over the book that came after him. Let us explore, slowly, what is known. At some point in his life, tradition places this in his middle age. In his 50s, Confucius left Lu and began to travel. The chronicle called the Shiji, the records of the grand historian, written by Sima Qian roughly 300 years after Confucius died, is the main source for what those travels looked like. Sima Qian's account is tradition rather than certain history, and we hold it as tradition. But the shape it gives is this: roughly 14 years, an old man and a small group of followers, moving between the small warring states of the time, Wei, Chen, Kai, Song. He was looking for a ruler who would employ his ideas, a ruler who believed that a state could be governed through virtue rather than through force, a ruler who would, in some form, let him put into practice what he had been teaching. He did not find one. Not in any lasting way. He was welcomed in some places, dismissed in others, threatened in at least one. In the state of Song, tradition holds, someone tried to kill him. His followers were alarmed. He was not. He said, in the account that has come down, that heaven had entrusted him with a mission and that therefore no harm could come to him there. Whether he believed this with certainty or said it to steady the people around him, the book does not say. Both readings feel true to the character the book gives him. He kept moving. 14 years is a long time to be wrong about what you are doing, or to be right about what you are doing and wrong about whether it will work. The distinction matters. He was not wrong that virtue was better than force. He was wrong or unlucky, or both, in thinking that the right ruler was somewhere on that road and could be found. He returned to Lu an old man. He taught. He mourned Yanhui. He watched the world continue to go badly. And then, in 479 BC, he died. An ordinary death. Not a famous one. Not a battlefield death. Not an execution. Not even a clear illness recorded and named. He died the way most people die, and what he had been was left behind in the people who had listened. That is the shape of the life. And here is the thing about that shape. He failed, by the measure he had set. He wanted to govern. He did not govern, not in any way that outlasted the moment. He was a teacher who wanted to be a counselor, an advisor, a man with real power to change the way a state was run. He looked for that power for 14 years on the road and came home without it. By the terms his own tradition set, the idea that the man of virtue would naturally attract followers, that the good ruler would come to him, that heaven was present in the workings of the world, the wandering years are a record of disappointment. And he knew it. The book is full of that knowing. There is a line in Book 7.1 that stops, every time. I transmit but do not create. I trust and love the old. In Chinese, Shu Er Buzu. He wrote it, or he said it, and someone wrote it down. The most influential teacher in Chinese history, describing himself not as a source, but as a relay, not an originator, a transmitter, someone who carries something forward that came before him, who passes on rather than makes. That is a remarkable thing to say about yourself. It is also, if you sit with it, a very specific kind of humility. He is not saying he is unworthy or small. He is saying that what matters is older than he is, that the value was already there before he arrived, that his work was to keep it alive and legible, not to invent it. He loved the old rites, the old music, the old ways of governing, the old forms that he believed had held human life together well when they were practiced properly. He was not trying to build something new. He was trying to stop something old from dying. And in the act of transmitting, he changed everything. That is the quiet irony of it. The man who said, I do not create, reshaped how 2,000 years of Chinese thought understood virtue, governance, learning, and what it meant to be a decent human being. He did not do it by announcing that he was making something. He did it by keeping something alive long enough for the world to realize it needed it. He transmitted. And in the transmitting, he made. Take a slow, deep breath. There is a passage in the Analects, Book 2.4, that has the feeling of a whole life compressed into a single sentence. It reads, and the translations differ slightly, but the shape is the same in every version, at 15. I set my heart on learning. At 30, I took my stand. At 40, I was free of doubts. At 50, I understood the will of heaven. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the line. Let that be still for a moment. He is not speaking about a philosophy. He is not explaining a system or presenting a method. He is narrating. He is looking back over a long life and naming the quality of each stage, the way an old person might tell a grandchild, at 15 this, at 30 that, at 50 I understood something I had not understood before. It is the most intimate passage in the book. It is also, when you look at the ages, a record of very slow progress. 40 to arrive at freedom from doubt, 50 to understand heaven, 60 for the ear to finally be attuned, and 70, his last age mentioned, close to the age he actually reached, to follow his own heart without going wrong. He died at 72. He had 2 years, if the book is true, in which his heart and his conduct were in alignment. 2 years at the end of a life of study, of wandering, of teaching, of grief, of wanting, of falling short. 2 years of following his heart without overstepping. And then he died. There is something very plain and very honest about that arithmetic. He is not saying he achieved goodness early. He is not saying it was easy or that it came as a reward. He is saying it took everything, the whole life, every year of it, up to the end. And even at the end, what he claimed was not sagehood, not mastery, not arrival, only that he could follow his own heart without doing wrong. That is a small claim for a very long journey, and it is also, perhaps, the most truthful one. Let us pause here, take a slow, deep breath. Notice what has grown quieter. Notice if your body has grown heavier where you are resting. There is nothing to reach for in any of this. Just let it settle, the way things settle when you are not trying to hold them. The book keeps its founder unfinished. That is not an accident of compilation, not a gap left by careless students. It feels deliberate, or at least true to the man they remembered. Because he kept saying it himself. He kept confessing, in entries scattered across the 20 books, that he had not managed it. He said he had never met a person who loved virtue as much as they loved beauty. The Chinese word is often rendered as physical beauty or sensory pleasure, but it is broader than that. The word is sei, and it points to everything that draws the eye and the appetite. Everything that pulls you away from the harder work of being good. He was including himself in that observation. He had never met such a person. He was not claiming to be such a person. He said he could not claim humaneness, ren, for himself. That was the central word of the whole text, the quality the book circles around and approaches and asks about in every direction. And when he was asked, directly, whether he himself possessed it, he declined to say yes. He did not claim sagehood. He did not claim wisdom in the way a founder of a tradition might be expected to claim it. He said he was fond of learning. He said he was tireless in learning and unflagging in teaching. Those he could say. But the man who carried Ren in himself as a full and steady possession, he had not met that man, and he did not count himself as that man. He grieved, near the end, that he could no longer dream of the Duke of Zhou. The Duke of Zhou was the great minister of the Zhou dynasty, the figure Confucius looked to as the model of how a good man should govern and serve. In his younger years, he said, he dreamed of the Duke often. And then the dream stopped. He said it matter-of-factly. He was old and worn. The dreams had gone away. He was not dramatizing the loss, not turning it into a grand statement about age or failure. He simply mentioned it, the way a person mentions something when they are old enough that loss has become familiar and there is no longer any need to make it large. The book leaves him like this: not triumphant, not resolved, old, tired. Having spent everything on a vision that the world had not yet chosen to follow, still surrounded by students he loved, still saying things worth remembering, still not claiming to have arrived. That is the man the book gives back. Let us explore one more story about this. A quiet one. Stay with me. Imagine, and I mean this only as an image, not a history. Imagine a room near the end of one of those long evenings when a student has asked something for the 100th time. What is Ren? What does it mean to be truly good? And the old man has answered again. A little differently this time. Because the student is different, the evening is different, the answer that will reach this particular person is not the same answer that reached the one before. The room is not a grand hall. It is not a temple. It is the kind of room where teaching actually happens, a little worn, familiar, with the feeling of many evenings having passed through it. And when the student leaves, the old man sits. He is not writing anything down. He did not write things down. That was not how he understood his work. His work was the conversation, the live exchange, the answer tuned to the person in front of him. The writing was for others, the speaking was for the room. So he sits, and he does not write anything down. And somewhere out there, on another evening, years later, or decades later, a student of one of his students picks up a piece of bamboo, or silk, or whatever surface was at hand, and begins to write what he had heard, the master said. And then the one thing he remembered, and then the brush stopped, because that was all he had. That is how the book was made. Not in the room, not by the man in the room, later by the people who loved him, working from what they had been able to keep. Take a slow, deep breath. There is an honest thing to say here, before we finish, about the version of Confucius that has travelled the farthest. In the United States, which is very likely where many of you listening tonight are lying awake, the name Confucius has been attached to a particular kind of fortune cookie saying. Confucius say, the joke goes, and then something vaguely wise-sounding or gently absurd. The fortune cookie itself is not a Chinese invention, it is a Japanese-American invention baked in San Francisco. And almost none of the sayings attached to Confucius say in that tradition were ever said by Confucius. They were invented, attributed, passed around, separated from any source, and eventually stamped with his name the way old proverbs get stamped with the name of whoever happens to be the most quotable figure nearby. The two English translations most Americans have actually heard the real book through are Arthur Waley's, published in 1938, and D.C. Lau's, published in 1979 as a Penguin classic, the small, familiar paperback. James Legge translated it in the Victorian era, and his version sits on older shelves. Waley's rendering is literary and precise. Lau's is plain and readable. If you have ever seen a real quotation from the Analects in an American context, in a classroom, in a philosophy book, in something that quoted the actual text, it was probably in one of those voices. The real book is plainer than the greeting card version. It is also stranger. It does not have the polished, complete sentence quality of a quotation poster. It has the quality of a notebook, an assemblage, a collection of things written down by different people on different days, trying to hold on to something that was already passing. It is abrupt. It repeats itself. It contradicts itself, because the person it records was answering different people on different days, and different people needed different things. It is not a system. It is a residue. And that brings us gently to the end of the evening. Let us pause here for a long moment. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your body be heavy. Let your thoughts, if they are still moving, move more slowly now. There is nothing left to figure out. We are just coming to rest together. The Lunyu, the Analects, is, when you hold it plainly, a strange kind of document. It records the most influential teacher in Chinese history. It shaped how education, governance, family, and virtue were understood across a civilization for over 2,000 years. It became the text at the center of the imperial examination system, the one book every educated person in China was expected to know, the one set of ideas that structured public life for dynasty after dynasty. And its author wrote none of it. What survives is what people remembered him saying. That is all. No treatise, no argument built from beginning to end, no system laid out in order. Just the fragments. The ziyu, the master said, followed by whatever one person managed to hold on to. Followed by silence. Followed by another, the master said, from another day, another setting, another conversation that someone happened to be present for and happened to recall. The great Han dynasty scholars, centuries after 479 BC, gathered the versions that existed and tried to reconcile them into one received text. There were competing manuscripts. There were gaps and repetitions. They did their best, those scholars, to make something coherent from what had come down to them. But the coherence was always partial. The gaps were always there. The book has never fully smoothed out into the kind of thing a single author would have written, because it was never made by a single author. It was made by time and memory and love. And here is the thought I want to leave with you tonight. Every life leaves a residue. You know this already without having thought about it precisely, because you have already been left the residues of other people's lives. The thing a grandparent said once that you have never forgotten. The sentence a teacher used that changed something in the way you saw a problem. The remark a friend made in passing that you did not know you were recording, but that you were, and that you have carried since, and that you still return to sometimes in the dark. Those are your Analects. The things you have happened to remember someone saying, and the things that will remain of you in the minds of the people who love you will be exactly that. Not the systematic version of yourself, not the argument you would have made if you had had time to arrange it properly. Not the complete, finished, coherent account of your own life and what it meant, just what they happened to catch. The remark in the kitchen. The thing you said when you didn't know anyone was listening. The answer you gave that was tuned to that particular person on that particular evening. Kongchu, Master Kong, called himself only a transmitter. He said he did not create. He said he trusted and loved the old. He spent 14 years on a road looking for someone who would let him be useful and largely came home without finding him. He watched his favorite student die. He dreamed, and then stopped dreaming, of the man he had always wanted to serve. He reached 70, and for a little while could follow his own heart without overstepping. And then he died. He did not write a word of the book that carries his name, and the book has been read for 2,500 years. Because people remembered what he said, because they loved him enough to try to keep it. Because the fragments they assembled, imperfect, unsmoothed, contradictory, abrupt as overheard remarks, turned out to contain something true about what it is to be a person trying to live decently in the world, about learning as a pleasure, about a friend arriving from far away as a joy, about the distance between knowing something and living it, about the long, slow, never quite finished work of being good. Let us pause here. Take a slow, deep breath. We have met, tonight, many things. We have sat with the opening lines, the pleasure of learning, the joy of the friend who comes from far away, and understood why the book begins not with a command, but with something quietly glad. We have been inside the abruptness, the roar the master said with nothing before it and nothing after, and understood why it reads like an overheard remark rather than a composed teaching. because that is what it is. We have heard the negative golden rule, do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire, given to Zigong, the eloquent one, as the single word a person might practice for a lifetime. We have sat with Yan Hui, the poor and brilliant favourite, the one who went months without straying, who died young and left his teacher saying, "Heaven has bereft me." We have sat with Zilu, brave and blunt, and corrected more times than the book can count, who died far away in Wei. We have sat with Zigong, who stayed 6 years at the grave when ritual asked for 3, and with Zengzi, who every evening asked himself whether he had been faithful, sincere, and present. We have heard the Junzi, the exemplary person, quietly redefined from a matter of birth to a matter of conduct. We have heard the rectification of names, the idea that the world comes apart when words and things stop matching, and that this worldly refusal, patient and calm, to speculate about what comes after death when there is still so much work to do in the life at hand. We have been with the man on the road, moving between Wei and Chen and Kai and Song, looking for the ruler who would listen, and coming home having not quite found him. We have heard I transmit, but do not create, and understood what a strange and large thing it is for the most influential teacher in Chinese history to say about himself. We have read the one-sentence life, 15, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and sat with the arithmetic of how slowly things actually come. And we have heard him say, more than once, in the plain way of someone who has stopped pretending, that he has never met a person who loved virtue as much as pleasure, that he cannot claim goodness for himself, that the dreams of the Duke of Zhou have gone. He said all of these things in passing. He was not performing humility, he was not building a system of self-examination for others to admire. He was just telling the truth, as best he could, on the days when someone asked, and he felt like answering. And his students listened, and the students of his students listened. And somewhere, on some evening in the Han dynasty, a scholar gathered all the pieces together into the book that would be called the Lunyu, the edited conversations. And from that book, the Weili translation and the Lao translation would eventually come, and from those translations the words would travel into American libraries and classrooms and paperbacks read on late nights by people who wanted something old and plain rather than another system, something that felt like a person rather than a doctrine. You do not need to remember any of it. If one thing stayed with you tonight, one image, one line, one moment where something settled gently into place, let that be enough. The rest is already in you somewhere, the way all of it was already in the students before they wrote it down. You have been listening. That is the whole of what is asked. The book is not a monument to a great man. It is a record of what the people who loved him could not bear to forget. That is what makes it live. That is why it is still arriving, after 2,500 years, into nights like this one, a quiet room, a voice, an old conversation being carried a little further forward. He said he was only a transmitter. So are we, all of us. We carry what we have heard from the people who loved us and the people they loved. We pass it on in the things we say in passing, in the remarks we make on ordinary evenings that someone, without knowing it, is already beginning to remember. The book has no author. The life has no final draft. What remains is what was heard. Let that be enough. Let yourself be still now. Take one more slow, deep breath. Let it out slowly. Let your body rest completely where it is. Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Subject closed for the night. Let it all relax away. The wandering years are harder to hold than the book. They live mostly in Sima Qian's records of the grand historian, the Shiji, set down roughly 3 centuries after Confucius died. And so we receive them as tradition holds them, not as confirmed chronicle. But the shape of the wandering is there, in the Analects itself, between the lines, an old teacher, moving between small warring states, looking for one ruler who would let him govern by virtue rather than by force. He travelled to Wei, to Chen, and to Kai, and to Song. 14 years, the tradition holds. He was already past 50 when he set out. He was a man who had studied ritual and music and the old records, who had trained many students, who believed in the plainest possible terms that if a ruler practiced Ren, genuine goodness toward the people, and held the right ceremonies, the state would order itself without cruelty. He went looking for a ruler who believed the same. He did not find one. Take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders settle. When you are ready, we will continue. He came home to Lu an old man. He had not been given the office he wanted. He had not reformed a government. By the ordinary measures of a life in his time and place, he had failed at the project that occupied his middle age, and so he taught. He gathered students around him, and he talked, and they listened, and some of what was said stayed. There is a line in Book 7, one of the oldest portions of the Analects, many scholars believe, where he says, "I transmit, but do not create. I trust and love the old." Shu Buzu. He was referring to the old texts and ceremonies, the record of the early Zhou kings he kept returning to. But the line does something more than that. The most influential teacher in Chinese history looked at everything he had done and said, in effect, "I did not make anything. I only carried something forward that was already there." He called himself a relay, not a source, a relay. Take a slow breath here, in and out. Let the quiet deepen. In Book 2, the 4th passage, he described his own life in one sentence. He said, "At 15 I set my heart on learning. At 30 I took my stand. At 40 I was free of doubts. At 50 I understood the will of heaven. At 60 my ear was attuned. At 70 I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the line." And then he died. He was 72 or thereabouts. He had spent 57 years trying to bring his own nature into alignment with what he believed goodness required. The sentence contains the whole arc, and the arc simply stops at 70. Not at a monument, not at a triumph, at a man who had, near the very end, found his footing. The book keeps him unfinished. He says, more than once, in different forms, that he has never met a person who loved virtue as much as they loved pleasure. Not once, not in a lifetime of looking. He cannot claim the title of sage. He cannot even claim to have fully attained Ren, that quality of genuine human goodness he spent everything describing. The founder of a tradition that would carry his name across 2,500 years says quietly, in the book that bears his teaching, "I have not managed it either." This is the truest thing in it. Let yourself breathe. There is nothing to hold tonight. Let the weight of the day release a little more with each breath out. Most of what arrives in American life as Confucius is not quite him. The fortune cookie sayings are jokes built on a caricature, and most of the sincere quotations that circulate on cards and in social media threads were never said by him in anything close to that form. The real translations most American readers have encountered are Arthur Waley's from 1938 and D.C. Lau's Penguin Classics from 1979. Both are careful and genuine. And still, what they translate is genuinely strange. The real book is quieter than the reputation, plainer, more fragmented, less like a system of thought and more like a person talking on ordinary days, recorded imperfectly by people who were not always in the room and who remembered what they could. Here, then, is the thing the whole night has been walking toward. Confucius is considered, by most reckonings, the most influential teacher in Chinese history. His thought shaped education, governance, ceremony, family life, and ethical practice across East Asia for more than 20 centuries. And what remains of him is only what people happened to remember him saying. In passing. In the middle of an afternoon. A remark made to a student who came with a question. A line offered at a meal. The thing he said on a day when he was tired, or grieving Yan Hui, or watching Zilu go off into danger again. His students held those words. They told their own students. Their students, eventually, wrote it down. That is the whole record. Which means a life leaves behind not the philosophy we intended, not the completed work. What remains is what was heard, the thing said on an ordinary evening that someone, without knowing it at the time, had already begun to carry forward. Take one more slow breath now. Let it move through you and release. Tonight we have walked with a man who spent 14 years on the road looking for one ruler who would listen, and found none. We heard him call himself only a transmitter. We heard the one sentence he made of his 72 years. We heard him say he had not fully managed goodness himself, and watched the people who loved him write it all down anyway, because they could not bear to let it go. You do not need to hold any of it. If one moment settled in you quietly tonight, one word, one image, something that simply felt true and restful, that is enough. You have been listening. That is the whole of what is asked of you. Sleep well now. Welcome to Relaxing Subjects. Subject closed for the night. Let it all relax away.